Hi, I'm Owen from Rask Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the Rask Network. Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over. Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you'd get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program. Kanish Chugh, welcome back to the program, mate. Always a pleasure.
Owen, thanks for having me back.
We're going to talk about the FTEC ETF, the Fintech and Blockchain ETF that you and the team at ETF Securities have just come out with. This is a really interesting ETF for many reasons, not just in terms of the companies, which we'll get to, that are inside, the thematics, the kind of sub-thematics or sub-themes that are inside the ETF. Many of them, our listeners would be familiar with things like the cashless society or cashless basket, blockchain, the rise of like fintech and wealth platforms, cloud computing, and alternative credit. There's a heap of stuff in here that is kind of revolutionizing the way that people engage with the intersection of finance and technology. To start things off, though, maybe I'll throw it over to you because this ETF is actually a little bit different, and I think it's because of the blockchain angle. Can you explain basically how this ETF came to be and some of like the, I guess, challenges you had and what it offers?
Yeah, definitely. So I think a lot of people are aware and comfortable with the term fintech. Essentially, it's finance and technology, and it's not a clearly defined sector in terms of what fintech is. But essentially, it's companies that are involved in disrupting the financial space. So whether that's, as you mentioned, payments, and we all know about Afterpay and Zip and IOU, for example, or even Tyro is a really good example from an Australian perspective. But that is sort of the fintech space. It can be sort of broadened out into sort of a few different areas. One of those being blockchain. And that is a really interesting space, or decentralized finance. So what we wanted to do from an ETF security standpoint was say, okay, we're wanting to bring out unique solutions. We're wanting to bring out ETFs that are not offered in the market, but are capturing mega trends that investors want to get exposure to. Yes, within the fintech space, there are a lot of now fintech companies in Australia. We've spoken about some of them, but Zero, Hub, Netwealth, for example. But what about the broader global space, and how can an investor go, well, I want to get exposure to that? And so we thought launching a fintech and blockchain ETF was a really unique solution for investors and a way in which they can get exposure through their portfolios through to this thematic. In terms of blockchain, though, I think that's important just to understand, what does it actually encompass? And the idea of DeFi or decentralized finance, and its umbrella term, it's for a variety of different applications and projects that are working in that public blockchain space. We all sometimes think blockchain and we think Bitcoin. And yes, there is, Bitcoin is from the blockchain technology, but it's more than cryptocurrencies, and what blockchain could be. It's probably the most important sub-trend of the fintech thematic.
So in terms of buying this ETF, FTEC is the code. It's not listed on the ASX, right?
No, it's not. So this particular ETF, it's actually listed with Chi-X, which is the other exchange that operates in Australia. So a lot of people, from an investor standpoint, may not know who Chi-X are. They are, the second largest exchange in Australia. They've actually recently were bought by SIBO, which is a very big US exchange. So they've got really strong backing from a global perspective. I think they have, I was hearing from Vic, the Chi-X, I think they've got about 25 to 30% of trading that happens on Australian, stocks and funds that they capture. But from an end investor perspective, they may not even be aware that there are two exchanges or that their trades go through Chi-X. So there's sometimes if they put a trade through in ComSec, what actually happens? Well, ComSec from their end, so at the platform level or at the broker level, they essentially put their orders through. And for some funds and stocks, they can only be done through the ASX, but majority can be done through both ASX and Chi-X. And so from an investor perspective, it just seamlessly happens. So they actually don't see where the trades go through on the exchange side. But from our perspective, the reason why we listed this fund with Chi-X is, it's quite apt that we're listing a fund that's thematic on fintech, and we're listing it with a disruptor in the market. We want to promote competition in the market in Australia, especially at the exchange level. We want to diversify the listing providers that we work with. And I think it's a really good match for FTEC as well. And we've had ongoing dialogue with the guys at Chi-X for a number of years. But that connectivity, for some investors, there are some platforms and some brokers that aren't connected still to the Chi-X exchange for whatever reason. So what I would suggest is anyone that's looking to invest in FTEC, if you can't see it on the platform or you're having issues, we'll call up the platform that you deal with, send them an email and just confirm and ask them, how can you trade this particular fund? Because obviously it'll be a bit of a work in progress as well, just to get that 100% connectivity for Chi-X as the exchange with all the different providers.
So if you're using something like ComSec, because I can use ComSec, I log in there and I see that some of the orders go through Chi-X and some of them go through the ASX. Just for those that are really green and new to this, it's just that there's in Australia, we have one exchange that kind of dominates, which is ASX. Then there's Chi-X, whereas in the United States, there are many. And the difference is here that because it's one big one, it's basically all the brokers normally integrate with that first and then go along with Chi-X. So the FTEC ETF, FTEC is available via Chi-X, and it cashes in on 5 kind of themes within the fintech and overall thematic of where does technology play with finance. So at risk of, we don't want to go on for too long, but as concisely as we can, how do you define each of these kind of 5 subsectors? I actually own quite a few shares. As I was looking through the list of companies in this, I was actually noticing that I own quite a few shares. Maybe you can go through each of the sub themes, if you like, Kanish, and then identify 1 or 2 companies within them that are kind of interesting for our listeners.
Yeah, so interesting though, the actual index that we track has 9 sub themes that it looks at. So there are 5 that I think we often people talk about. So of the 9, there are digital payments. So they're companies that provide digital modes of payments, whether it's mobile, online, digital wallets, prepaid cards, etc. So companies like Visa, for example, could be classified as a digital payment. Afterpay, Square, for example, potentially, Afterpay in particular is a digital payment company. So that's a really good example there in terms of a digital payment company. You've got trading and capital markets. So this is interesting because within the trading and capital market space, this is a sub theme that essentially engages in that provision of providing, trading platforms, services to investors and traders. So to trade ETFs, some people may not realize, but a lot of the trades that happen with ETFs go through what's called a market maker. And market makers are crucial in the ecosystem on an ETF side. And so companies like Virtue is a really interesting example of a company that actually is part of this index and part of this ETF, but that's a trading in capital markets. That's an example of fintech. Financial data providers and analyzers, so things like companies that provide financial tax or accounting, corporate data, and offering sort of analytical and indexing solutions. So companies like Xero, for example, can be considered in that space, and obviously from an Australian perspective. Point of sales, Square I think is classified as a point of sale systems, even though they do a lot of different things, but they're very much known as a point of sales, as a sub-thematic. And that, that infrastructure has really developed in the past 5-10 years. It was dominated by the banks. If let's cast our minds back, and that's where a lot of the point of sale systems and software and technology was very much dominated by banks. Now that's no longer the case. You've got personal finance software. That's another sub theme in itself. Tax compliance software, and then financial enterprise solutions as well. Scalable technology solutions that are disrupting traditional areas of finance, and then obviously DeFi. So I'll just touch really quickly on sort of, we talked about Square. PayPal is another really interesting company. Again, a lot of people will know on PayPal. One of its, it's because of online shopping. PayPal has been one of the biggest winners. And what people, it's interesting, I think, going a bit on tangent here, but there's a bit of a PayPal network, because if you actually look at some of the founders and people that started at PayPal early on and see where they've ended up, you actually can see they've ended up in most of Silicon Valley, and Elon Musk is one of them as well.
Yeah, the PayPal mafia.
Exactly, the PayPal mafia. But their products include things like Venmo, who, if you've ever been to the US, you'll know that Venmo is a really widely used app to transfer cash between people, or Honey, which is it's the largest coupon website. It connects businesses to consumers, or even Braintree. So Braintree helps companies with their e-commerce setup. So again, PayPal is a really diverse company that is operating above and outside sort of just a payments technology system. And another interesting one is Black Knight. So Black Knight's an American company. Black Knight essentially work on mortgages. So if you think about, obviously in Australia, we all look at home loans, and, we're all trying to, property is always front of mind for everyone, especially at a barbecue. But, for banks that lend money to households, and for banks and brokers, mortgages require those credit checks. They require, the property valuations, the compliance, the monitoring, all of which at the moment are, somewhat done manually, and they can have a human error. So Black Knight is an American company. They produce some software and that data analytics that does a lot of the work for the banks and the mortgage brokers. So essentially, they've made writing mortgages a lot easier, and removes a lot of that human error. So they're just some of the companies that sort of the fintech, and blockchain ETF gives exposure to. I haven't talked about blockchain though, and the decentralized finance theme, but that is really interesting, because obviously within that space, this ETF doesn't have pure Bitcoin exposure. I think that's really important. It doesn't have pure crypto exposure, but it has exposure to companies that are involved in crypto, but are also involved in just blockchain infrastructure and technology. So if you really believe that, you're not sure whether to buy some of these cryptos and, what to do around that, but you believe in the underlying technology that's been developed, which is blockchain or decentralized finance, well, then there are companies such as, Hive Blockchain. Coinbase is an example of a company that does a lot within the crypto space. Obviously, it's a crypto exchange. It's, I think it had one of the most successful IPOs this year, and they're a feature within this ETF.
It's actually really interesting, because it's the interplay of blockchain and fintech is actually really important. So we've got companies like, I was really interested in reading a white paper actually, and seeing that because I'm an investor in PayPal, and I study it pretty closely, and I obviously follow Venmo pretty closely too. But actually seeing how there's an interesting chart here, which we'll include in the show notes. But actually seeing there was a survey done by Cornerstone Advisors of US consumers, and seeing how much more people are using PayPal versus the other like players. So it's over 60% of respondents say that they use PayPal. And to put it in context, the next closest was Apple. It looks like it was just under 30% Apple Pay, and then Google Pay similar. But in fourth place was Venmo, around about 20% or so. And so you can see how big PayPal is in that payments ecosystem. So that's a really interesting thing. But the way that types into blockchain is PayPal has a team that's committed to blockchain and doing these types of things too. And we saw Square's founder come out and talk about their own ledger, which is kind of like Ethereum, which is basically just utilizing the blockchain to make payments more effective and more efficient throughout the world. So it's kind of like this whole intersection of multiple different things. And I think the blockchain angle works in with that. So you've got Coinbase. do you have off the top of your head, just catching you off guard here, perhaps any of the other types of companies that might be included in the ETF over time?
Yeah, so look, from a DeFi perspective or decentralized finance blockchain perspective, companies like Galaxy Digital, Riot Blockchain, Northern Data is another one. So Northern Data is a German company, very much operating in that sort of DeFi space. So they're just some of the DeFi companies at the moment. Now, the ETF is focused on the fintech and the blockchain thematic within the blockchain element. So each of those 9 sub themes I talked about, 8 of them can have a maximum of 10 stocks within the index. So there's 75 stocks in the index itself. 9 of them can have a maximum of 10, but DeFi can have a maximum of 20. So again, they have to pass through certain screens, depending upon, how pure revenue purity on the sub theme that, the index is looking at, liquidity screens. So they have to have, really high minimums, market size and trading, etc. But if they pass through all those screens, they're the maximums that it can have. So it can very much tilt towards the DeFi space. At the moment, the ETF, as it's launched, will only have, has only 6 companies really associated purely within the decentralized finance space. But yes, it has companies like Square and PayPal, which, as you mentioned, have really strong links with blockchain. So indirectly, it's got a lot of other blockchain exposures, but pure on the sub theme as we've defined it, there's 6 at the moment.
So how about then? I mean, it's a relatively new ETF, so investors have to keep that in mind. So we've got 75 companies in total. Of the DeFi side of things, are capped at 20, but in each the sub themes or thematics, there's 10. How these many of these companies are actually pretty well established these days. You would associate normally fintech with a bit of volatility, but many of them are multi-billion-dollar companies, over $100 billion companies in some respects. How does an ETF like this play into a portfolio, do you think, like best?
Yes, yeah. So just I guess on the index, just quickly, we've adopted an equal weight methodology because as a thematic on fintech and blockchain, again, you don't necessarily want to be exposed to the biggest or the smallest. You want we believe that the thematic will win out. And so we've adopted the sort of an equal weight approach in terms of the weighting. So at each rebalance, once those underlying stocks related to those sub themes have been identified, each of them get an equal weight within the portfolio. So it's 75 names, each of them at each rebalance will be 1.33%, basically. Now, in terms of its position within a portfolio, again, with like all of our thematics, we've identified megatrends that are long term. And so we see them either as core or satellite exposures. We generally say to clients and say to investors, timing the market or timing thematics can be really, it may be more harmful than positive for performance, because it's really hard to time these sorts of things. And so it's playing tactical in a space like this. We sort of believe, well, this is a long-term megatrend, so it's more of a sort of 3, 5, 7-year play, even longer than it is a 18-month play, for example. So in that way, we sort of say it's a satellite component generally is how we're seeing investors use it. It's a complement to the building blocks that investors already have within their global equity space. It is diverse across, sectors. It's agnostic to sectors in its index construction. It's, yes, dominated by a number of US companies. So people need to keep that in mind. But the other important part is, well, how does it cross over with other thematics? So again, we get this question. I think I mentioned it in the podcast that we did on hydrogen. And we talked about, well, is there crossover with thematics? Do I need to choose the fintech thematic over, say, the hydrogen thematic or the tech thematic or, robo, whatever it may be? This particular ETF at the moment, again, only has a 3.8% crossover with our tech ETF, which is our tech sector products. There's only 2 stocks that cross over with the fintech, FTEC, and tech. That's really important. So outside of that, there is no crossover. And even at those 2 stocks, it's very minimal as well. So you can, in theory, still hold those 2 and not have a lot of overlap, because that's the last thing you want within your portfolio. You don't want to basically own the same names in different, in different methods.
For sure. So this is an ETF on Chi-X, FTEC. Um, got the management fee of 0.69 quarterly rebalancing and semi-annual half-yearly distributions. It's obviously domiciled here in Australia, which makes it easier from a tax perspective. Um, really interesting ETF, very interesting, in fact. So this is FTEC. You can find out more at etfsecurities.com.au. Kanish, always a pleasure to chat, mate. Thanks for joining me on the program.
Oh, and thank you for having me.